Frużelina Frulow bez dodatku cukru. Teraz w 3 nowych smakach. Jeżyna, czerwone owoce i porzeczka truskawka. Kupuj w sklepie SFD.
Partnerem kanału jest XTB. Aplikacja inwestycyjna, z którą zaangażujesz do pracy Twoje pieniądze.
Twoja karta ma 0 benefitów? Zmień ją na kartę Zen.
Partnerem kanału Zero jest producent boskich kiełbas bez osłonki JBB Bałdyga. Jedz bardziej bosko.
Najnowszy magazyn Zero już dostępny. Wyzwania władzy i polityki. Generał Rajmund Andrzejczak i profesor Sławomir Dębski o nowym prezydencie Polski. Zamów na magazyn.zero.pl. Włącz powiadomienia i nie przegap żadnej nowości. Pobierz już teraz. Zeskanuj kod QR lub znajdź nas w swoim sklepie z aplikacjami.
W kolejnym odcinku Ground Zero witają Państwo Rajmund Andrzejczak,
Sławomir Dębski.
Today we have an almost a pleasure and honor to host in our show Rebeccah Heinrichs, Hudson Institute, one of the best American experts on foreign policy, security, nuclear issues. Nuclear deterrence. And we want to, focus our conversation today with Rebeccah on nuclear things, hard stuff. Rebeccah, it's great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Rajmund, I think let's start from the first thing. Why the United States still needs the set of alliances?
Sure.
What do you need allies for?
Well, I'll say the United States needs allies today, possibly more than we ever have. So after the Second World War, the United States, of course, has had some deployments abroad, American deployments abroad. And the purpose of that, of course, was to use the advantages of geography of our allies, to use the expertise of our allies, and to collaborate in ways in order to maintain the peace against shared threats. It's better to deter conflict than to fight it, but then if we have to fight it, it's better to have friends on your side, and the more, the better. Today, I have argued that allies are more important than ever, because unlike during the Cold War, when the United States had one major nuclear adversary that was imperialistic, the United States has a very complex threat environment. So now we have the Russians that still pose an acute and chronic persistent threat to American interests, and also the People's Republic of China, the Chinese as well. And those two countries are increasingly collaborating. And so for the United States to deter both, we need the collective strength and cooperation from our allies. And we can do it in a variety of ways, but I would argue that's primarily the importance of allies and the importance of the United States being forward deployed, projecting power abroad with our allies, also protects the American people at home by keeping conflict as far away from our shores as possible.
Well, I put some additional players, which is North Korea or Iranian aspiration, of course. But the last night I was reading your book, which amazed me, and you inspire me very much. So it sounds like to deter, it's a duty. Well, but I found a lot of things about the moral aspect, which will be, I think, our center of gravity. I was a little bit surprised. Tell me, what was the purpose? What happened that you had a appetite to read that kind of book?
Well, a few years ago, I see a lot of trends in the American public debate and discussion about what is America's role in the world. How much should we invest in our own defense and deterrence? What is the purpose of allies? And I realized a lot of it rhymed with the historical debate in the United States during the Cold War. And one of the big debates during the Cold War was, what should our nuclear deterrent strategy look like? And at the time, sort of the moral arguments were arguing for disarmament. Those who were making moral arguments thought that the most moral argument was for peace at all costs, for nuclear disarmament, that there was something inherent about nuclear weapons that was immoral. And it was really the Nixon administration and that came along and said, well, let's think about that. Well, what happens if we develop a strategy in the name of morality that actually increases the likelihood of the very war we're trying to prevent? And so it's not, morality isn't just about your intent, it also has to be about the effect. What are you affecting? And so shouldn't we then develop a nuclear strategy and a nuclear posture that increases the likelihood to deter, to prevent war, and then also is made in such a way that it's likely that we would be willing to use it in a particular way that would comply, that would comport with our ideas of the laws of armed conflict and of appropriate ethical warfighting. And that was the debate that we had, and it really since the late 60s through the 70s was a major change in U.S. strategy, where we were constantly trying to tailor our nuclear strategy so that it was as credible as possible and in line with America's moral beliefs about warfighting, and that would thereby also increase the credibility of the deterrent threat. And I just thought, man, we're going to have this debate again in the United States and with our allies as we now seek to tailor our deterrence, because the Russian nuclear threat is real, I think, and we should take it seriously. And so is the Chinese one. And so I try to get ahead of the debate to say, look, I'm going to make a moral argument in favor of actually increasing the credibility of our nuclear deterrence.
Which mean moral, because deterrence is about sending message. There will be punishment, there will be consequences. And then you're achieving the point, deterrence is effective or not. So finally, you have to use it. So what's the distinction between those?
It's a great question. So deterrence relies on a paradox. My objective is to preserve the peace, to prevent war, but for a reason. I want to preserve peace and prevent war because I do believe that the dignity of human life, democratic governance, the freedom of the individual, national sovereignty, trade between free nations, those are all values that are worth defending and protecting. So if I believe that it was peace at any cost, well, then you can also surrender and choose subjugation. But we see the result in Ukraine. What happened? We see the result in Ukraine. We see the result of those who would want appeasement and capitulation over freedom and independence and national determination. And so, if these other things are important to you, then you also have to be willing to defend it. Okay, that means you seek to impose a cost on your enemy who wants to take that from you, and you have to convince him that you're willing to fight for it. And that's how you maintain deterrence, that I can impose a cost on you for doing X, Y, and Z against my interests, and you should not do it because I'm willing to do it. I have the ability to do it, and I'm willing to do it. And the more you can convince your adversary of that, the more likelihood you can to prevent. But again, it does rest on this paradox, because deterrence rests on the credible threat of force and then your ability to execute that.
So would you say the full disarmament would be immoral somehow?
I would. So I argue that that American, and really for NATO is a nuclear alliance, that disarmament would run afoul of our duty, of our government's duty to protect our people and to protect those fundamental principles of which are worth living, the purpose of government and human flourishing. And so to disarm would be to increase the likelihood of a deterrence failure, and it would cede the control to our adversaries who have no qualms about violating those sacred principles.
I remember President Barack Obama traveling to Prague and delivering famous speech about the global zero. So that's, that should be something on the global agenda, and the United States should lead the process. It was some time ago. I don't believe that Barack Obama really believed that it's achievable goal under his clock. So actually, what was the driver behind this kind of the proposition?
Well, actually, even President Reagan, who I admire so much, he would sort of dream out loud about a world in which We didn't have nuclear weapons, but until that day came, the United States of America would maintain a safe and secure and reliable nuclear deterrent. And then, of course, President Reagan also wanted a missile defense system so that we were not relying only on offensive retaliation. And I think President Obama really came out of that disarmament view that the most moral thing would be to move away from nuclear weapons and seek disarmament. Of course, that's a much easier thing to advocate for when you're not in power, when you're not in government. And when he won the presidency, and we all know the difference between saying something you want to do and then feeling the weight of the responsibility of your actions that could affect millions and millions of human beings. Yeah, and I think that one of the great things about, at least in my country, I think in other countries too, but I know mine the best, is that the campaign trail is often very different than what happens when these people are in positions of governing. And that's what happened to President Obama. He argued for some of the most radical changes that would be a departure from American nuclear strategy when he was on the campaign trail. And then once he got into office and got his briefings and felt the pressure to make these decisions, he actually agreed with the Republican-controlled Senate. He was the one that negotiated the New START treaty with the Russians, the last and it wasn't disarm, but the last arms control treaty that we currently have in place, although it's about to expire and the Russians are cheating on it. But in order for him to secure that treaty, the Republicans required President Obama to modernize our own nuclear weapons. And he did, and he agreed with that. And then he did not pursue some of the more radical disarmament objectives. He didn't. So he got the Peace Prize for the aspiration, but then reality hit.
Which is still morally okay. The aspiration, but in the real world, it doesn't work. So it's really important and symbolical, because we speak in Warsaw. Not so far away is the statue of John Paul II, which is a point of orientation for us about the moral issue. And I'm absolutely sure that during your research and your preparation, when you prepared the book, was some kind of a skepticism or even nuclear pacifism. Mm-hmm. So what kind of challenges you met and what kind of narratives?
Sure. So the first, one of the most important writings on the morality of nuclear weapons comes from the Catholic Church. They wrote the bishop's letter on disarmament. It's actually the most serious treatment of the topic, and it was produced in the 80s. And what the Catholic Church at the time concluded essentially was really grappled. It's a pretty lengthy document, so I spend a lot of time going through the arguments, because if you're going to make an argument against something, you really want to take your opponent's strongest argument. That's the fairest way to have an intellectual fight with somebody. And so really the strongest argument, I think, was the bishop's letter. And essentially at the time it concluded that, goodness, disarmament seems like it would increase the risk of nuclear war, so we don't really want to do that. But then the bishops also really struggled with the concepts from the just war doctrine of proportionality and discrimination. Are there ways in which we can employ a nuclear weapon that would fulfill those criteria for just use? And they essentially concluded, they were having a hard time concluding that they could. So they ended up resulting with this not disarmament, but no use. They couldn't justify use, but then they also couldn't justify disarmament, and they ended up with essentially stuck. And so I argue from there that really they were misunderstanding from a strategist's mind how we think about nuclear employment and strategies. They were close to the ethical part, but then sort of missed the strategist mindset, which is that nuclear weapons are never going to be. Should the United States have to employ a nuclear weapon again? To deter the worst kind of aggression against our allies or the United States. There will be civilian casualties, just like there would be with conventional weapons. There are conventional non-nuclear weapons, there will be civilian casualties. However, the employment strategy for nuclear weapons can still satisfy the criteria of the just war doctrine, because we do not target, which are discriminate. So we do not target civilians. We do not target civilians as such. The United States doesn't do it in any of our warfighting doctrine. And nuclear weapons do not have an exemption. So they are required, and part of our targeting strategy is that we only target that which the adversary values most, which
so
is...
it means the headquarters...
Their headquarters, regime survival. So we can be very specific about the Russian government, just
infrastructure.
Infrastructure that war-supporting industry, the means of control of their population. So what those particular, if you think about China, what those might be to control their population. And their strategic systems. They can be non-nuclear, that can have large strategic effects, and their nuclear systems. So that's what we want to be able to hold at risk, which means we want to be able to convince our adversary we can, no matter how deeply buried you put them, no matter how far you put them into tunnels and put all kinds of integrated air and missile defense around them, we can reach out and touch them with a weapon that can successfully have a physical package that can destroy it. Military targets. And to do that, actually, you really have to follow it here. In order to have a kind of nuclear posture that can convince the adversary we can do that, it actually needs to be quite large. Because it needs to be able to be flexible, to be able to point out all of these different ways in which we can reach out and touch these and blow up these different things. But and with variable yields. So we might want to go out and destroy this particular thing, but we do not want it to have a significant footprint depending on where it's located. And so you want to have variable yields of explosive power. So those who argue for disarmament, who want fewer nuclear weapons, if you want to have a nuclear arsenal that has fewer nuclear weapons, they actually have to have a higher destructive capability, which would run afoul of the just war doctrine. They might also, in fact, cause the adversary to believe that you wouldn't use them, or that you would only use them in the most extreme circumstances. But the way the United States does it, we have a nuclear posture to defend our allies. If we only had a nuclear posture to defend ourselves, we could have fewer nuclear weapons, that maximum, capacity to only protect the American homeland. But we have a nuclear posture that we want to be able to convince the Russians, no matter what yield you use, no matter where you use one, we have a credible proportional response that we can deliver to compel you not to do it again.
This is interesting because we have so many discussions about nuclear issues, especially the recently in Poland, about the potentially alternative, French or British, or also about the nuclear sharing, but never had a discussion about the moral aspects. You also sharing with us, because having capability is one thing, but is it any agreement, any discussion, whether we understand that you are putting so much attention on the moral aspect of using? Yeah, that's interesting.
That's exactly the point of our discussion. I wanted to bring all of us, because actually here is a paradox. More nuclear capabilities you have, more able you are to conduct a just war. That's the paradox.
Well said, yeah.
And the problem here is twofold. There is exactly this conversation in Europe, whether Europeans may somehow substitute nuclear deterrence if United States policies towards Europe change. How much nuclear potential is enough? So there's another question. So let me ask you, because you are also a co-author of a report for Congress about U.S. nuclear posture and how it should adapt. I mean, I recommend our viewers to read this document, because it's first the newest attempt to clarified the very important issue, to contribute to U.S. strategy on nuclear issue. So how much nuclear potential the United States needs, how many nuclear weapons is enough, and if you can make this connection to this just war.
So first, the reason that, again, in the Strategic Posture Commission, so you just mentioned I'm one of the commissioners on this bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission. Congress required that this commission be constituted because the last time they did it, it was 2008. 2009, about, I think, whenever they issued the report. And the world has changed since then. Russia's full-scale invasion. So first their invasion of Ukraine in 2014, where they unjustly took Crimea, and then full-scale invasion in 2022, and Russia's nuclear coercion and saber rattling that it did in order to carry out its conventional invasion. And Russia has been engaged in a full-scale modernization effort of its own nuclear weapons. So that's important to know. And I like to tell allies to remind them that when the Russians modernize their nuclear weapons, they make new ones. They have novel systems. I might tell them the Russians, if it has wings and wheels, they put a nuke on it. I mean, they are really building out their theater nuclear weapons that can span Europe, and also reach the United States in a couple of cases of their novel systems. The United States, when we modernize our nuclear weapons, we've been modernizing about since 2009, since the last Strategic Posture Commission, and then really in response to this deal that the Republicans in the Senate made with President Obama for a New START to modernize our triad. That modernization plan, we concluded, the commission concluded, is necessary to finish it. It's not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient for dealing with both China and Russia. Okay, so this is your question then. So what's the nuclear potential need? So we argued that we need to adapt our posture. The most likely scenario in which deterrence will fail is not going to be a massive attack against the United States as one of the most powerful nuclear nation.
Goes to the Golden Dome.
Golden Dome is going to help that, we'll get there. Yeah. But the most likely, we concluded, scenario in which deterrence will fail is going to be in theater, in the European theater or in the Asian theater, because these nuclear revanchists, so they're trying to redraw borders by force, both the Chinese and the Russians, making claims to territories and peoples that they have no claim to, and they're doing it by focusing more on their nuclear weapons in order to scare the United States from coming to the aid of our allies. And so what we argued
so escalate to de-escalate. This kind
yeah,
of
and the way I try to explain it is if they can use so let's stick with the Russians in the European context. If the Russians can use a nuclear weapon in such a way that it would scare the American people, and then by them being scared, the American government into saying we're not going to risk further escalation because we don't have. For whatever reason, we don't have the capabilities that we think that we're confident that we can respond with that could convince the Russians to step down. Forget it. We're going to back out. I think the Russians would be wrong about that bet. I think that the United States, and even during the Biden administration, which I had my own criticisms, I wanted our government to be much bolder. But President Biden, Jake Sullivan, issued pretty clear threats that if the Russians were to use a nuclear weapon anywhere, that the United States would make them regret that without being specific about what that was. But my argument is if the United States does not want to be so easily coerced, which I believe the United States was coerced through nuclear saber rattling, the best way to do that is for us to have the confidence by adapting our nuclear posture so that we know that we can convince the Russians we actually have things that we would be willing to use that we know could actually deliver the capability and the effect that we want to compel the Russians to step back.
Okay, before we go to the tactical and strategical effect, I was really inspired by your moral aspects. And I'll go back for a second for a very important day, the 6th of August, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets is taken off and flying to Hiroshima. And there was not a proportional attack. There was a civilian target, definitely. So it's a kind of a confusion about the just war and the first and the only example that we can refer. So how would you assess the first employment of the
And I would add it into that because there's a kind of the nuclear aspect of this. But before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, United States and British allies, I mean, in a kind of the democratic alliance against Nazis and fascism and Japan militarism, they were using a carpet bombing against, German cities.
The firebombing campaigns.
Japan cities.
Which were actually in the numbers much
actually
more,
they were targeting civilians, in indiscriminatory way. So how about this? The Second World War was not just war in this time.
So I'm gonna just make one last point about the last point about what the debate in Europe right now. I would just say we still appreciate what France can contribute to complicating the adversaries' calculations about nuclear employment. And of course, our British friends, the United States works very, very closely with our British friends on that nuclear component. But I would just bluntly make the point that the French neither have the capability nor the doctrine to carry out flexible responses the way the United States does. So it has to do not just with
constitutional
numbers.
or legal frame.
I mean, I would just simply argue that the France's doctrine and how they would think about employing a nuclear weapon is not credible for the kinds of threats that the Russians are threatening to employ. And so if the French want to do more with nuclear deterrence within the alliance, I think that's great, but they should start participating in ways they have not thus far in terms of the council, et cetera, the Nuclear Weapons Council. So, okay, so moving to your question. So the debate about the targeting in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is still one that historians can go back. And I have a very good friend that actually does argue that with the knowledge and information we had, we did target military targets while also knowing that it was in a city area. So in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were certain war-supporting industry and military that were there that were intentionally hit, but that clearly there were better ways and different things that we could have hit that would have had fewer civilian casualties. His name is Mark Levecki, actually, Dr. Mark Levecki, and he's got a book coming out on this as well, specifically on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I guess I would make a different, I think that the United States, it's the first time nuclear weapons had been used. We used them to end a horrible war and to prevent the invasion of the island, which it would have taken the life of my grandfather. I mean, I think every American has stories about actually my great-grandfather on my mother's side and my grandfather would have both been part of the invasion had the bombs not been dropped. And so saved a lot of American lives by dropping the bombs and ending the war in that way and getting the Imperial Japanese to stop. It also saved a lot of Japanese lives, I think, because the war would have continued to go on. So it's an unsatisfying answer because I still think that that it is lamentable the number of civilian casualties. The other thing to note, though, about the Imperial Japanese at the time, the number of Japanese, in order to get a battle to end, you had to kill like every single Japanese individual. They took no, I mean, the rate before they would surrender was something like
Iwo Jima is example,
exactly. Mm-hmm. And so their political will to fight, and think about the kamikaze pilots, et cetera, was so high that it did take, I think, Hiroshima and Nagasaki to get.
And at the same time, we have some arguments that was not necessarily to win a war. The U.S. Air Force, there was supremacy. The industry that was absolutely overwhelmed. So that's the challenge we have today.
So the debate,
assessing.
I think, in hindsight, people are still kind of looking at that. I do believe, though, that the Truman administration at the time really believed it was necessary to end the war. Necessary to end the war and wanted to send a message that the United States had this destructive capability and the will to use it for other adversaries that we saw over the horizon that were looking. And obviously that was the point of Nagasaki as well. So it wasn't just Hiroshima. I think Hiroshima has a much more moral grounds, very defensible. Nagasaki is the one that's a little bit shakier because it was the second employment, although you can see the military utility in convincing the adversary. We might keep doing this. You really should stop.
Would you say that was deterrence of Russia or Soviet Union at that time in the end of the war?
Because a little bit. Yeah. I think a little. Certainly, there's historical evidence that was on their minds. Mm-hmm. But I would just say that the United States, when you look at historical events, you have to give those military and political leaders some grace because they were dealing with their own time and context with the information that they had. And I think now, and I argue this in my book, what's really interesting is, the United States didn't have a deterrence strategy when we were thinking about how to end the horrific Second World War, we were trying to end the war and do it as on the really with the lowest number of American deaths as possible, and so and that's what they were thinking. But if you read my book, I argue that really that's when through the 60s and then really the 70s, you really start seeing deterrence strategy develop. Now, how do we think about, because we didn't use the nuclear weapons in Korea when there was an argument, should we do this? And really
MacArthur had some appetite,
yeah, and Americans essentially said, these are weapons that are different. They have clearly a military utility, but we do not want to normalize the war-fighting use of these weapons. They are both military, yes, but political weapons. But that had to be developed. That thought had to be developed. And now the way the United States thinks about nuclear strategy and our nuclear doctrine is much different. It's much more sophisticated, and it's been bipartisan across administrations, which is that we have a strategy now specifically designed to be flexible, to provide the President of the United States with many options, so that if deterrence fails, we're going to go for the lowest levels of violence possible to compel the adversary to back down. We're not gonna wait until another world war before we think about the highest levels of violence. We're going to try to keep the war down on the lowest levels of violence as possible. And you need a pretty sophisticated and diverse nuclear arsenal to do that.
Well, Rebecca, promise me, if you ever had the chance to talk to the Pope, now the likelihood is pretty high. Please ask or discuss at least a few things, because I was really thinking pretty long night about the moral aspects. So we can find in the Old Testament and New Testament a couple of interesting stories about deterrence, demonstration of power, and consequences of prevent aggression or sin. If you're looking in the Moses and Egyptian plagues, if you see Noah's Ark and the flood, with some, the announcements of God of destruction and a corrupt world, you see Jesus cleaning the temple. So that's interesting. That it's some kind of employment of arguments and instruments, and explaining the consequences if you're not following the rules. So it's not so far away from the basics.
So I do make an appeal. So let me get back to sort of the moral component of this. The West is different. We're different. We're different because, and this is why it's important, I think, for us, because there's a big, robust debate about what are our political similarities, what are our values and principles. And part of it is we believe in the dignity of the human person. Our Jewish brothers and sisters do too, and so you can appeal to the Old Testament, but that also it's very Christian. And to make this argument,
China is different.
It's very different.
Russia,
and in fact, the Russians see it very, very differently. And so it's important that we understand, because Americans have this problem, I think, more than our other Western friends and allies, which is that we think that others think about the world the way we do. Americans just, so there was a hard time, the Americans had a hard time believing that that Putin would actually do his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We just couldn't, I mean, I knew he would, but there were many Americans who, because I understand that Putin doesn't think about things, though he has a different set of values and principles and national objectives than I think should be his. I have opinions about what Putin should think, but he doesn't share my views about what he should think. And so it's important for the United States to understand that our adversaries think very, very differently about the role of government and its relationship to the person than we do. And we have a long history of thinking about this, and it has affected our own strategic culture. So when we think about international law, when we think about the laws of armed conflict, all of those, if you read the United States' Department of Defense military manual that we use to train every single rank in the military, it talks about how we do not target civilians. We treat civilians in a particular way. We appeal to discrimination. We appeal to proportionality. That's Aquinas. That's, you can look at Luther and Calvin talking about, so it's Protestant and Catholic, appealing to these ideas about ethical ways of war fighting. because it matters. There is no country that is operating in an absence of moral thinking. It's just that we have a particular way of thinking about it.
Promise you, if you have a chance to talk to the Paul,
I will. I'll give him my book.
That's a fascinating part of our conversation, also from the kind of the theoretical point of view. There is an argument, usually introduced by so-called realist theory about on international relations, that actually the only thing which matters are interest of the state and power, and power is used only on behalf of interest. Now we are talking about nuclear issues, and we are talking about nuclear argument in this conversation, which in classic way of thinking should be used as a argument in favor of that only great powers, are possessing nuclear weapons, have a say in international relations, and only interests are, are the main drivers behind the foreign policy. Suddenly, you are introducing us to the completely different argument that this, the values, the way how we think about usage of nuclear weapons are important, that our principles are the main drivers of our foreign policy. Could you, elaborate a little bit?
Sure.
How you do you think about yourself as a realist in this theoretical? Yeah.
So I think I'm the most realist.
Yeah.
So I would say that, and I debated. I had the privilege of debating Mearsheimer on PBS about Ukraine and Russia, actually, and I think that I have a much tighter grasp on reality than he does.
I agree. I agree.
And it's because, to be realistic, I mean, the reason Aquinas and others started thinking about the just war doctrine is because war was the reality, okay? But Christians were not exempt from moral behavior. So if you're going to go and you're going to fight for your country, which according to the Bible, it is a just government protects the innocent and avenges the wicked. That's what a just government does. A just government protects its people and seeks to impose costs on those who would harm the innocent. And the Bible is very clear about that's what the government does. And that there's a role for government that's different than civilians. So if you're a civilian, you've got a different responsibility in the government. But the government actually, it would be an immoral government that does not protect its people. And so that's a reality. And so I would argue that where the realists get wrong is they try to make sense of the world without thinking about the human element about how we think and fight and what we want to protect and what's worth defending. And so they make a great error in some of these human elements. I like to say back at, we're not robots, we're people. And so if everything was just about distributions of power, then it could make a lot more sense and be more predictable, but it isn't. You have different strategic cultures, different degrees of willingness to take on risk and pain, different reasons that you're willing to fight for your own people and to what degree. And all of these things matter a great deal. And so I have argued that to be truly realistic, you must take into account how the United States thinks about morality, because that's going to affect what we're going to do in any particular scenario, and how our adversaries think about it very, very differently. So I consider myself a Christian realist or a moral realist, principled realist, however you want to think about it. I try to make that distinction because I think that that gives us the best way to assess how to carry out our interests in the world. I mean, my interests are rooted in something. And Russia's interests are rooted in something. The Chinese Communist Party has interests that are rooted in very, very different things. It's not simply about, getting wealthy. They have an ideology. And so you have to take into account a nation's ideology, strategic culture, government, et cetera. Role of church, role of the civilians as citizens, and you have to think about that in order to do the best you can at assessing what an adversary may or may not do and how we might respond.
Well, I haven't found any specific, doctrines or, readings about the Chinese approach, but Dębski, Dębski very well, Dima is, Dima's description about the Russian nuclear orthodoxy. He used the phrase orthodoxy. And I was really surprised the role of the Russian church and mythology in the nuclear aspect. So the Dima says that Russia sees itself as a nuclear power, not only in technical terms, but also spiritual. And for Russians, nuclear weapons is a guarantors of greatness, independence, and moral order, which is far away from our standards. Possession and use, civilizational mission, and deterrence, space shaped by history, identity, and spirituality. So if you're talking about the comparison, U.S. approach with the moral aspects to nuclear deterrence and a Russian approach, what do you see that is completely different?
One would be we do not have that degree of a mix. We have no established church that determines how we employ our nuclear weapons. So that's a really big distinction in terms of the American way of war in particular. Though we still glean our moral and ethical understanding. There in the Catholic and Protestant traditions of thinking about the role of church and state is that you have two kingdoms. You think about the kingdom on earth and the kingdom in heaven, and you have different realities on this side of heaven where you have to deal with hard and imperfect things and human behavior that is it is wrong and not always in perfect accordance with what is right. And so we make the best we can. In other words, we might carry out great force, but we do it with lament. It's always, if we know that we're killing civilians as an aside and not with great intent. If you take all of that, the way we think about war and warfare, and compare it with the Russian Orthodox Church and the way it thinks about, and you can see this with Ukraine, you can even take the nuclear component out of it. And there is an overlap and a blending of a spiritual mission that this is what they're doing. It is. And it's why it's been so difficult for Ukraine and for Zelensky to deal with. Yes, he wants religious expression and freedom inside Ukraine, but if you have these essentially arms of the Russian Orthodox Church that is directly helping the Russian military, how can you do that in a state of war inside a country that you're trying to make sure the world understands is free and democratic? It's hard. It's a very, very difficult dilemma that he's in. But there is a very, very drastic. I mean, if you go through Russian literature on nuclear use, it's pretty scary stuff. It's much more forward-leaning and much more willing to use nuclear weapons, and they don't begin with the first principles which we have, which is that the human person, the individual human person created in the image of God, Imago Dei, means that you certainly don't want to use force if you don't need, if you can avoid it. So our default is to try to solve conflict without violence. That's not the Russian way of war. It's not how they think about it, and it's not how they think about it violently, and it's not how they think about it with their nuclear doctrine. It's very, very different. And so what that means is, the West still has a hard time believing that the Russians would actually use a nuclear weapon in war. Like, why would they do it? That wouldn't make any sense. And there's lots of reasons where they wouldn't do it from a military perspective. But we should not misunderstand that they have a different standard and a different belief about the cost of nuclear war against a human population.
So I want to dig into this a little bit. We see in Ukraine that we are dealing with immoral government in Russia. Well, they are decided to go into unjust war in the classical terms. I mean, they are ready to sacrifice thousands of hundreds of people to grab territory of the others. So it is clearly by definition.
They're targeting civilians.
Exactly. By definition, we are dealing with immoral government. This immoral government is at least toying about redrafting the doctrine about nuclear weapons and about use of nuclear weapons. The strategic signaling has changed. They are talking more and more about tactical use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Then they are talking about use nuclear weapons in the Baltic states. They have been training nuclear attack on Warsaw, not long time ago. So how we, our running by just government, should react to this kind of the challenge?
It's a great question. So, and I think just to underscore the really serious point you're making is that the Russians are much less hesitant to think about maximizing human suffering for the purpose of their military and political objectives. We have to understand that as those of us who are in the West. And this is why I believe I still am a realist, because you have to understand what the adversary is willing to do so that you can come up with a better strategy. I mean, NATO has spent a lot of time patting itself on the back for the way it's helped Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. And there have been some very good things, I think, that are worth kind of looking at and saying this is good. But there are some things, I think, that have not been good. One is we have been, I think, very risk-averse for dealing with the Russians as it has carried out this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and very nervous about escalation and very unwilling to take on risk ourselves for fear of the possibility of further escalation. And when you're in that dynamic, the country that is willing to maximize human suffering and to escalate is the country that will win. So we have to think about, okay, we must find then, we have to understand that, and then get the political will to do what is necessary to get this very unjust government that's imperialistic, deeply inhumane.
But in this certain example, it looks like pretty effective, the Russian nuclear deterrence on сдерживание, they say, which is slightly different meaning. The Dima is, exercising the languages, specifics. So it looks like Russians are still effective in nuclear deterrence.
Because what they're doing,
deterring us.
They're deterring us, and this is why Americans like to say that we are self-deterring because it gives the United States
more red lines we put into ourselves.
It is. But the truth of the matter is, the hard truth is, the Russians are deterring the United States in leading and helping the alliance provide the necessary support for Ukraine. And I can lay out this, how they've done it. From the beginning of the war, the Russians do nuclear saber rattling. And this is why I disagree with the Russians' characterization that they're deterring. They say that they're deterring through nuclear saber rattling, but deterrence is inherently, from my perspective, defensive. No, deterring.
It was Dzerzhiwanie. That was not defensive posture.
Right. Ukraine posed no threat to the Russians. There was no, if anything, my argument has long been that NATO was not strong enough and that we didn't supply Ukraine with sufficient weapons to make Ukraine strong enough to be able to convince, because deterrence only relies on what the adversary believes. So we can say we did enough, but by just reality, we did not, because the Russians made the decision to invade. Okay, and then we withheld HIMARS, and then we withheld ATACMS, and then we withheld long-range ATACMS, and then we waited till the Russians moved some of their critical military assets out of the way before we delivered the ATACMS to the Ukrainians to be able to hit those things further into Russian territory. In the beginning of the war, there was a debate in the Congress about whether or not the Congress, Democrats and Republicans, wanted the United States government to provide real-time intelligence to the Ukrainians. And the belief was among Congress that there was a delay, that the United States, for fear of the Russians calling us a co-combatant with the Ukrainians, were basically waiting like 30 minutes. We would see where the Russians were, and then we would let the Ukrainians know like 30 minutes later. Well, that's not sufficient for the Ukrainians to do what was necessary, and so we changed that. So I believe that the United States is providing much better intelligence, timely intelligence to the Ukrainians.
Any Prosper, light in the tunnel right now concerning the U.S. change in the policy?
My argument, so we don't know. Things are dynamic. It's a new government in the United States, obviously, and some of the trends I think have not been super encouraging. But I'd remind people that President Trump is a very results-oriented guy, and when things do not have the result he wants, he's non-ideological, and so he's happy to change course. What I have argued is what the United States needs to do in order to have essentially the moxie necessary to help Ukraine do what is to have a better hand so to speak, to use, I think, an overplayed metaphor here lately, to end this conflict on terms that are good for Ukraine, the United States, I think, does have to adapt our nuclear posture. The reason the Russians have been so bold in what they've been willing to do is because they have 10-to-1 theater nuclear weapons versus NATO. And they've been able to threaten to use them in such a way that has caused the alliance to think, I don't want to risk this. I don't know if we'd be willing to do X, Y, and Z. And so we don't want to further escalate. So we're only going to basically keep the war a long war of attrition, protraction. If NATO can adapt its nuclear deterrent such that we have the confidence to convince the Russians, don't you dare, any possibility of nuclear employment, we will make you regret that. Therefore, you should not do that. And we have a suite of options to make you regret that. That will increase the credibility of the alliance's strategic deterrence. And we can do a lot more on the conventional side then if we have that confidence for that nuclear backstop.
So it brings us to the NATO strategic posture and how we should adapt this, changes in Russian doctrine. NATO enlarged itself. We have Finland, Sweden now are our eastern flank countries, eastern north flank countries, and there is a ongoing debate inside NATO about enlarging also nuclear sharing program. So the way how we should respond to the Russians' actions, both on doctrinal level and also on let's say technical level, is to say, okay, now NATO is larger and NATO should be also more capable, and there are countries willing to join a NATO sharing program. The problem is, of course, political to some extent, because first, it requires the decision of the United States government to share nuclear weapons with new allies, including Poland, Finland, Sweden, perhaps. Then there is another political part of the picture is the will of European allies, the current members of nuclear sharing program, to include to the club 2 or 3 more. What's your argument on this debate? Should we do that? Because we pose, regardless political kind of the political picture here, regardless who is governing in Poland, there is a bipartisan consensus that Poland should join this club. Also because Russia believes that there is a kind of the still invisible iron curtain within the alliance, that there are new members and old members, and if they use tactical nuclear weapons, they could drive the wedge between the allies.
So I guess I would answer it in a couple of ways. There's a lot there to unpack. First, I still think it is a good American goal to maintain non-proliferation. So in the nuclear club, those who have nuclear weapons, we would like those who don't have them not to get them, whether they're friends or adversaries. And that's just because, for many of reasons, of the possibility of nuclear employment goes up, just statistically, the more countries that have them, et cetera. And I think for the NATO cohesion, et cetera, it is a harder thing if you're going to actually have more countries join the nuclear club, so to speak. However, I also understand, I mentioned the point that deterrence relies on the adversary being convinced that the United States would use nuclear weapons in defense of our interests. Nuclear assurance, what we provide our allies, that we will come to your defense with our nuclear weapons. Nuclear assurance relies on our allies' belief that we will do it. And that means that the United States has to take the kind of care that we make sure that our adversaries believe that we might do X, Y, and Z to impose costs on them. We have to take a high degree of care with what our allies, for what they need for their assurance. And I believe Poland is completely justified for saying, hey, we're on the front of this thing. We're the pointy end, of the spear here. And it's Poland, the Baltic countries, Finland, Sweden. I mean, this is where, and I say, you know, I remind people, the alliance is only as secure as those countries are secure, period. So Germany, France, you must care about the security of Lithuania, of Estonia, certainly of Poland, Latvia. And so I think that we can make some adaptations. Americans, we can adapt, and we can bring in more allies who have assurance needs. And I think we can adapt it for the point that you raised. We want to convince the Russians that you're not going to slice off a piece of the alliance in this way, of the old and the new, et cetera. And so this is just speaking for myself. I'm certainly open to this idea of Finnish pilots and Polish pilots being trained on the new dual-capable aircraft, which would be the F-35.
Which goes to the nuclear sharing.
Which goes to nuclear sharing, but the United States keeps custody. So we keep custody of the weapons themselves, but our allies are certainly participating in the missions.
Sharing risk and responsibility as well.
Of risk and responsibility. And the Polish pilots have a long history of being fantastic and great in support of the alliance. And so,
Rebeccah, that's the point, very important, because sometimes when we, you know, Poland as a Christian country, and with John Paul II as the most symbolic, you know, Polish, and the role of morality in anything we do is extremely important. We are exposed to the Russian threat, and talking about the, you know, nuclear aspects, comparing more than 5,000 nuclear warheads in the United States, and then 300 French or 260 British, we're talking about 100 old-fashioned gravitation B-61 bombs. So the
modernized.
The modernized, some Mark IV or something. So from a military perspective and also strategical perspective, it seems to be closer to the concept of no proliferation, but just giving a message to the Russians, okay, Poles or Finns are in and are able to play a much more significant role in nuclear deterrence without any, you know, projects of building new nuclear weapons field in Poland or another project. So for me, from a practical point of view, of course, politically is extremely important because, you know, Germany, they're not sharing, you know, the same understanding of threat, but they are members of nuclear sharing. So that's the important point. How it looks like right now, how would it looks like from Washington today?
I mean, I think that there is, so I won't speak for, you know, everybody in my country, but or even in the expert community. But I do think that the Strategic Posture Commission, that was, I mean, we did not say that we need necessarily more weapons. We said that we could possibly. My belief is that we do need more nuclear weapons just because the target set is growing, and so I think it just makes sense that even if you were to upload the hedge, et cetera, you're still going to need more
tactical, you know.
Yes, to do what we need to do. But we did make the strong case that nuclear assurance of our allies is critically important. Yeah, the nuclear assurance of our allies, and that we're going to have to make some adaptations. Either or and in our posture or in numbers. And so I think that from Democrats and Republicans, there's a willingness and an openness to see what do we need to do. President Trump has made it extremely clear he does not want war. He does not want war. He certainly does not want nuclear war. He wants allies to do more. And so I see a lot of overlap here where we can do something very good. And the Finns are a great warrior people who can participate, I think, in a way that would be responsible and good and helpful for the alliance as well. So Poland and Finland, I think, are two wonderful candidates for this training mission for the F-35. And as you say, non-proliferation is kept and upheld, and yet it makes it, we need to be in the business of making Putin's his calculations much more difficult. You know, I'm tired of, I mean, I don't want to constantly advertise to the Russians what the United States may or may not be willing to do or what we're doing in some ways. I mean, sometimes you want, for stability purposes, you want to reveal what you're doing. And sometimes for deterrence purposes, you want to complicate his calculations. And so I think that it does complicate the adversaries' calculations when you see more integration with the alliance, more tied, the alliance putting significant value on the protection and security of Poland and the Baltic countries and our new allies in Finland and Sweden. And then also that their pilots are trained as well. And so if the adversary decides to go down this path, it would be very unwise because we have credible responses.
So like we have Finland and Poland totally, we have 100 F-35s. It's exactly the number of B-61 bombs here. So we could take all of them and
there was
Russians.
no need, I think there was no need to, somehow certify all our fleet. I mean, because that's the political
strategical
argument.
signaling is more important
But
for.
Our last question would be about kind of the argument which is being raised by some European allies. I've heard from Germans, so let this argument be more precise. Our German allies, that enlarging nuclear sharing program would send the wrong signal to the Russians. That would be escalatory.
Which is in opposite what we can find in your book.
Yes, that would be escalatory move. That actually the Russians would be forced, in the sense, to respond, and we would be somehow trapped in this escalatory cycle.
Yeah,
I
would respectfully say to my colleagues in other capitals, and I've had this debate with various experts as well, is that would they argue, and I think they would not argue, that the current state of affairs is stable. So they think that what I'm arguing would risk stability, and I would say, are you suggesting that things are stable? Because I would submit to you that they are not, that we have to change something. We are in an era in which the Russians have a significant numerical advantage over the alliance in theater nuclear weapons, and it's only going to get worse. And there's no indication that the Russians have changed back from their goals of subjugating Ukraine or of having goals to break the alliance beyond Ukraine. Truly breaking the alliance, I think, is to keep in mind of what the Russians want to do. And so we have to do something different because we are the ones that are defending the status quo. And I tell my ally friends this who argue against, I said, we have it clear in our minds, and the ethical and the moral, we're the defenders. And that means to be a responsible nuclear alliance, a responsible nuclear alliance is the one that maintains peace. So what is necessary for maintaining peace? I mean, I'd like to give
instruments.
Instruments, capability, and capabilities that we would actually use, that the adversary would believe that we would use. So I don't even want just gravity bombs on F-35. I mean, I think that we should have some standoff weapons on the F-35s as well. I think that would also be very good. I'd also we have a sea-launched cruise missile, the nuclear variant. That would be very good for complicating the Russians' calculations as well, and also the Chinese, because it can be anywhere at sea.
Dilemma in the theaters.
And I think that as an alliance, we're already talking about conventional, so to be clear, that's non-nuclear, ground-launched cruise missiles again that we're going to be putting in Germany, I think in 2027. I think we should seriously consider the possibility, begin discussing it, of a nuclear variant. I'd like to see a triad, so sea, land, and air in Europe, that would credibly deter the Russians. Again, we're the ones defending peace. And so the goal is not, this idea that we would be escalatory, again, number one, I would just submit that escalation is not the worst thing. Being subjugated is the worst thing. War is worse in general. And so so sometimes you need to escalate to win. And we are the ones that are on the side of justice and protecting the sovereignty of our people and our countries. And so what do we need to do in order to convince the Russians that we have the political will to defend ourselves? And so that's what I would push back. And I think that we're at an age where we're going to have to adapt from a hard power perspective.
Rebeccah, we cannot miss this opportunity because, in few days we will have a new politician in the role of President of Poland. You are briefing European politicians coming to Washington how to deal with Trump administration. Do you have short recommendation for new president of Poland how to deal with President Trump?
Well, just for the record, I would note this is not an American offering her perspective without being asked. I've been asked.
Absolutely.
And I would just say, look, I mean, President Trump has been very clear during his second term. He is committed to NATO. He's committed to Article 5 of the NATO alliance. He understands that if NATO is strong and lethal and robust, that's the best way to preserve peace in Europe. And so I think that some of the hysteria about whether or not the United States is committed to NATO is simply overblown. So to really understand that, and then also approach the American president honestly. President Trump he's looking for debate and for discussion. And so he's made it clear. I mean, there's been more, I think, Europeans coming in and meeting in the Oval Office and meeting with President Trump, I mean, at a pretty high tempo than we've seen in the past. And so I just hosted the finance minister of Norway, our former NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. I just hosted him at Hudson and had a wonderful conversation with him. And he's got a friendly relationship with President Trump. And I can echo his same sentiments: is talk to him, be honest, and also be clear about what Poland's worries and concerns and interests are. And to be very clear, and then also be fluent in and able to explain what Poland is doing. And Poland is a wonderful ally to the United States. But beyond the percentage of GDP that Poland commits to the alliance for collective defense, what else Poland is doing. And it's doing a variety of things that are good for the alliance, good for Americans, and certainly good for keeping the peace. All goals of President Trump and his administration.
Sławek, such a journey. So
That was fantastic.
Moses and Egyptian plaques, Noah's Ark, Jesus, cleansing, the Book of Revelation, F-35's deterrence, and Rebeccah.
Rebeccah, thank you very much
Big
for
pleasure.
being with us.
It's a joy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Szanowni Państwo, bardzo dziękujemy za uwagę, bardzo dziękujemy za wspólną podróż
Od Starego Testamentu do
od Starego
F-35.
Testamentu na Arce Strategicznej, inspirowanej Arką Noego. Jednym z pierwszych strategów biblijnych był Noe. Przypominamy, i naszym gościem była Rebeccah Heinrichs.
Dziękujemy.
Dziękujemy bardzo.
Frużelina Frulow bez dodatku cukru. Teraz w 3 nowych smakach. Jeżyna, czerwone owoce i porzeczka truskawka. Kupuj w sklepie SFD.
Partnerem kanału jest XTB. Aplikacja inwestycyjna, z którą zaangażujesz do pracy Twoje pieniądze.
Twoja karta ma 0 benefitów? Zmień ją na kartę Zen.
Partnerem kanału Zero jest producent boskich kiełbas bez osłonki JBB Bałdyga. Jedz bardziej bosko.
Najnowszy magazyn Zero już dostępny. Wyzwania władzy i polityki. Generał Rajmund Andrzejczak i profesor Sławomir Dębski o nowym prezydencie Polski. Zamów na magazyn.zero.pl. Włącz powiadomienia i nie przegap żadnej nowości. Pobierz już teraz. Zeskanuj kod QR lub znajdź nas w swoim sklepie z aplikacjami. Kliknij w jeden z polecanych filmów, aby obejrzeć najlepsze produkcje kanału Zero.